Well, hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Danny Lichtenfeld, Director of the Brattleboro Museum. So happy to be here with you this evening and really looking forward to tonight's conversation with photographer, author, and Executive Director of the Center for Railroad Photography and Art, Scott Lothes, and then we'll have a Q&A with all of you. This conversation tonight is presented in connection with the exhibit Charlie Hunter Semaphore, which opened at the Brattleboro Museum on June 19th and is on view through October 11th. The exhibit features paintings of railroad infrastructure, not trains per se, but signals, semaphores, tracks, stations, and bridges, all rendered in Charlie's distinctive style. So we thought it would be interesting to contextualize Charlie's approach to creating railroad-themed art within the broader scope of historical and contemporary railroad art. When we suggested this to Charlie, he recommended that we contact Scott Lothes, and so here we are. In just a moment, I'm going to ask Scott to join me on screen. The plan is that he will present for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to your questions and comments. To submit a question or comment, if you're here on Zoom, please use the Q&A or the chat button on your screen, preferably the Q&A button. You can do that at any time, and we'll get to your questions and comments at the end of the presentation. If you're watching on Facebook Live, you can type your questions or comments there, and we'll keep an eye on that too. Okay, with that bit of housekeeping taken care of, I'd like to ask Scott Lothes to turn on his camera and mic now and join me. And now that Scott's coming on, I'll just tell you a little bit about him. Scott is the President and Executive Director of the nonprofit Center for Railroad Photography and Art and the editor of its journal, Railroad Heritage. He's also a freelance writer and photographer concerned primarily with railroads and other transportation networks and how they interact with the lands they traverse. Scott has written dozens of articles and given numerous presentations on railroads and railroad art. He's the author or co-author of 7 books, including The Railroad Photography of Donald W. Furler, which was published this year by the Center for Railroad Photography and Art. Wallace W. Abbey, A Life in Railroad Photography, which was published in 2018 by Indiana University Press. And The World's Most Exotic Railway Journeys, published in 2015 by Beaufoy Publishing, for which Scott contributed 2 chapters and the cover photograph. Scott is originally from St. Albans, West Virginia, a town bisected by the railroad. He received an undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering from Case Western Reserve University, and he currently lives and works in Madison, Wisconsin. Scott, thank you so much for being here tonight and for doing this for the Brattleboro Museum.
Oh, Danny, it's my absolute pleasure. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And thanks everyone for tuning in tonight. Audio sounding good on your end, Danny?
It sounds good to me, yeah. If anybody's having any problems that you think we can possibly help with, just let us know in the chat. I'm going to leave the screen right now, Scott. I'm going to let you take it away. And then when you're ready for Q&A, just let me know and I'll come back on.
That sounds great. And if you do need to get a hold of me during the presentation for any reason, it's probably best to text me. Once I'm in presenter mode, I don't always see the Zoom notifications pop up.
Okay, if I need you for any reason, I might just unmute myself. And
that's perfectly fine too.
Okay. All right, take it away. Thank you.
Okay, thanks again, Danny. Thanks everyone for joining us. I'm just going to go ahead and get my screen share started, and then we'll get rolling here. Okay, so as Danny said, tonight to provide some additional context for Charlie Hunter's wonderful Semaphore exhibition, I plan to speak for about 45 minutes about the history and relationship of railroads and art, primarily paintings, but we'll also look at some other examples too. And as Danny said, I welcome your questions. We'll take those at the end. Feel free to send them in anytime though using the Q&A feature here on Zoom or the chat function on Facebook. And now for a little bit about me, as Danny mentioned, I grew up in West Virginia as well as southeastern Ohio, where I love to watch coal trains and launch model rockets. And I went to Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, where I received a BS degree in mechanical engineering. And if any of you have seen the movie October Sky, my childhood had at least a few parallels with Homer Hickams, although mine occurred about 30 years later, and I was definitely into trains more than rockets. Either way, I think Jake Gyllenhaal was a great choice for the lead role in that film. Now, as a child, I loved to draw, and I took as many art classes in high school as I could fit into my schedule. I stopped drawing, though, when I was in college, when I realized that my talents, or lack thereof, weren't reaching the visions I had in my mind for my drawings. But that led me to discover photography, which I've come to love deeply. And it also put me on this strange and surprising path that led me to the Center for Railroad Photography and Art. So let's get started here. And just as a little bit of background about the Center for Railroad Photography and Art, let's see, oh shoot. There we go. I just want to give you a little bit of background about our organization, the Center for Railroad Photography and Art. We're a nonprofit organization based in Madison, Wisconsin, and our mission is to preserve and present significant images of railroading. We don't have a museum or gallery space of our own. That's a model that has always served us well, especially though over the past 18 months. We host regional and national conferences. We prepare and circulate traveling exhibitions that go to museums and galleries all over the country. We publish books in a quarterly journal, and we maintain a growing archive that now houses about 500,000 images. Like the Brattleboro Museum and Art Center, we've pivoted to online programming, and our events are free to anyone who'd like to attend via Zoom. You can view all of our past presentations on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/railphotoart, or you can check our website, railphoto-art.org, or you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter for details about our upcoming programs. We are at railphotoart on all of those platforms. But tonight we're going to talk about representations of railroading in art, and so let's get started with that. And I mentioned both trains and rocketry. In 2019, we celebrated milestones in both rocketry and railroading. The 50th anniversary of the first Apollo moon landing, and the 150th anniversary of the completion of the first transcontinental railroad. Now I think it's fitting that we marked both of these achievements at the same time. The Apollo project was the literal moonshot of the 20th century, and the first transcontinental railroad was every bit as much the moonshot of the 19th century. Science and technology made possible both of these moonshots, but art can help us understand them. I'd like to share a quote from the New York Times book reviewer, who wrote the following about the Apollo program. The day of the first moonwalk, my father's college literature professor told his class, someday they'll send a poet, and we'll find out what it's really like. And that, I think, is what art aspires to. It helps us make sense of the world, and to better understand the impacts of all the amazing science and technology we create. Now, we still haven't sent a poet to the moon, but railroads exist right here, on terra firma, and they've been inspiring poets and artists of all sorts from their very beginnings. Now, my focus for this presentation is railroads and art. And to look at them, we need to come back from the moon and go back to 1829, when the Sturbridge Lion, the first steam locomotive to operate in the United States, arrived in New York Harbor. And like a children's Christmas toy, it came with some assembly required. And that took place outside, in the open air of the West Point Foundry Association, under the direction of a man named David Matthew. He wrote that the locomotive became the object of curiosity to thousands who visited the works from day to day. Now put yourself in the shoes of an early 19th century New Yorker. Think of the otherworldly intrigue you would have felt upon seeing a 15,000-pound mass of metal being assembled and fired up for the first time. These early locomotives were rock stars of their day, every bit as awe-inspiring as the Saturn V rockets would be 140 years later. Now, 1829 predated the invention of commercially viable photography by a decade. So if we want to know what this scene looked like, we have to rely on artists. This print, made nearly 90 years after the fact, depicts the Lion's first trial run on August 8th, 1829. I don't know how truly accurate it is, It clearly has patriotic overtones, but the details look believable, and I think it captures something of the energy of that moment. And that is the aim of this painting: rain, steam, and speed, an 1844 masterpiece in oil, 3 feet by 4 feet, by the British artist J.M.W. Turner. We've crossed the pond to England, cradle of the early railroads, and this is a scene from their Great Western Railway. As its name implies, the Great Western struck out from London to the west. It was built for speed, straight and flat, with a broad gauge of 7 feet, that's more than 2 feet wider than most of today's railroads. The locomotive here is of a type called the Firefly, and these were absolute marvels of their day. Their 2 driving wheels, one on each side, were 7 feet tall. When they were introduced in 1840, they began pulling scheduled trains at average speeds of 50 miles per hour. Now, average speeds include time for station stops, which means these trains surely hit 60 and above. Now think about that. All of human history up to that point, people could travel no faster than a horse could run. And then, almost overnight, you could go a mile a minute. Journalists of the day struggled to write about this, for they simply did not have the language to convey that kind of speed. But Turner gives us a sense for what it was like with this wonderfully impressionistic work. Even today, almost 2 centuries later, steam locomotives can still draw crowds. As to commemorate the Transcontinental Railroad sesquicentennial, Union Pacific restored one of its big boy locomotives, among the largest ever built, and sent it on a nationwide tour. It came through Wisconsin in July of 2019, and here it is on a Thursday morning, making a brief stop in the town of Friesland, Wisconsin, with a population of 200, where the center staff and well over 1,000 other people came out to see it. And you might even wonder whether we still need artists today, when everyone has high-definition cameras on their cell phones, as we can see in this picture. Now, spoiler alert, I absolutely think we still need artists. And I also think it's worth noting that even though the allure of the steam locomotive persists, the emotions they stir have changed. The sense of wonder endures, but the 1829 excitement for the new has turned completely around to a nostalgic longing for what once was. In the railroad, we have the full arc of steam technology, and here we see the great pull of nostalgia. We'll come back to that. First, though, I want to return to the mid-19th century and hear what 3 of our early writers had to say about the railroad. Nathaniel Hawthorne was born in 1804 in Salem, Massachusetts, and he is best known for his novels like The Scarlet Letter and The House of the Seven Gables. He also provides us with one of the first literary considerations of the railroad. One morning, Hawthorne sat in a New England forest writing in his journal, describing his tranquil setting in great detail, until, as he wrote, "Hark, there is the whistle of the locomotive, the long shriek, harsh above all harshness, for the space of a mile cannot mollify it into harmony. It tells a story of busy men, citizens from the hot street, who have come to spend a day in the country village, men of business, in short of all unquietness, and no wonder that it gives such a startling shriek, since it brings the noisy world into the midst of our slumberous peace." Now, as someone who grew up loving trains, the steam whistle is music to my ears. It's difficult for me to relate to these words, but let's keep going. Ralph Waldo Emerson led the Transcendentalist movement of the 19th century. He also wrote about the early railroads and what he perceived they would mean. The following passage comes from one of his journal entries. He said, "I hear the whistle of the locomotive in the woods. Wherever that music comes, it has its sequel. It is the voice of the civility of the 19th century saying, 'Here I am.' It is interrogative, it is prophetic, and this Cassandra is believed. Whew, 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 how is real estate here in the swamp and wilderness? Ho for Boston. Whew, whew, I will plant a dozen houses on this pasture next moon, and a village anon." Emerson writes with a driving force that echoes both the cadence of the locomotive and the impending changes it will bring to the land. His protege, Henry David Thoreau, is now considered a founder of environmental writing, thanks largely to his book Walden. Thoreau lived in a log cabin on Walden Pond near Concord, Massachusetts, from 1845 to 1847, which was right after the Fitchburg Railroad had completed its main line along the far side of the pond. Now you might expect Thoreau to build on his mentor and lash out further against the encroaching railroad and its shrieking trains. So perhaps then you will be as surprised as I was by what he had to say. When I hear the iron horse make the hills echo with his snort like thunder, shaking the earth with his feet, and breathing fire and smoke from his nostrils, it seems as if the earth had got a race now worthy to inhabit it. Thoreau was awed by this new technology, yet he did not allow his awe to blind him to what he saw as the profit-driven intentions of the early railroad builders, intentions he went on to criticize resoundingly in Walden. Now, whether I agree with his criticisms or not, my lesson here is that I study and even celebrate the railroad, or any form of technology. I also need to step back and consider how it's being used. Hawthorne, Emerson, and Thoreau were among the first group of writers to develop a distinctly American voice. Our nation was still young, the British Empire still large, and European notions of art and culture prevailed. Now, those notions set down clear ideas about what subject matter was acceptable for artists, and new technology was not on that list. The great painters of that age had been trained in figural, landscape, and genre work. The majority of the world's population still lived in the country, not the city. Painting a product of industry, like a factory or a locomotive, was simply not something a proper artist would do. Yet, as we've just seen in literature, the railroad was such a force of nature that it practically demanded artistic consideration. As we look at some early railroad paintings, keep in mind that the Western world was grappling with the sweeping changes of the Industrial Revolution, while artists were grappling first with whether to even approach industrial subjects, and then with how to actually go about painting them. So when the railroad does begin to appear in art, it first appears in the background. This is the first of a few paintings I'll be showing from board members Peter Moss's remarkable collection. Peter wrote an extensive article about his collection for our journal, and I'll be drawing on his remarks. This is a 2-foot by 3-foot oil painting by Arthur Fitzwilliam Tate, which he incorrectly titled A View on the London to Birmingham Line. Peter says it does show the Dutton Viaduct, which Peter says is actually located on England's London to Liverpool line. Now, its erroneous title notwithstanding, this is a beautiful work that is very much in the style of the pictorial landscape paintings of the era, with the pastoral scene of cattle at the edge of the stream dominating the foreground. The viaduct is in the distance, and the train itself is tiny. But it's interesting to me that the railway, the new form of transportation, is bathed in sunlight, while barely visible at the far right is the old way, the footpath, where a woman in red and a child walk in deep shadow, almost as an afterthought. Now, if we look at examples from American art, we see similar themes. This is Progress by Ashford B. Durand, a 6-foot wide oil painting on the theme of manifest destiny. And the train is even smaller here. It's crossing that low trestle way down at right. But as with Tate's work, the railroad and all of the instruments of industrial progress are in the sunlight, while a group of American Indians watches from the shadows at left. Durand was part of the Hudson River School, the first distinctly American art movement, founded by Thomas Cole. The Hudson River painters drew from Romanticism, but there are some key differences. The Romantics were reacting against the Industrial Revolution, and they tended to glorify the past. The Hudson River School was somewhat more embracing of change, and while they glorified the dramatic landscapes of New England, they also sought to reconcile the march of industrial progress. Much of their work strives for harmony between nature and technology. Within that vein, but also transcending it, is one of the most important railroad paintings of all time, the Lackawanna Valley by George Ennis. This was a commission by the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad. We often think of corporate art as containing propaganda, or at least clear biases. But today, the Lackawanna Valley stands as the most critically acclaimed railroad painting of the 19th century. We see many elements of the Hudson River School: warm light, pastoral landscape, a reclining figure in the foreground. But here the train is larger, more prominent, and the view includes much more of the railroad, particularly the roundhouse, almost like a cathedral in the distance. The foreground is littered with stumps, looking more like a recent battlefield than a harmonious blending of nature and technology. Ian Kennedy, former director of the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City, wrote that Ennis could not conceal his unease at the price of material progress and the spoliation of nature by a new technological system. I'll be coming back to Kennedy's insights a few times. I have one more painting from this era to show, and it's my personal favorite. Jasper Francis Crapsy's Storaka Viaduct from 1865. Its namesake subject opened on the New York and Erie Railroad at Lanesboro, Pennsylvania in 1848. Now, compared to the Lackawanna Valley, this painting presents a more typically harmonious view of the railroad and the landscape, but there are some key differences that make it a standout. Most paintings from the Hudson River School are set in the spring, in the morning, signifying the dawning of a new age. Here it is autumn, and since this view looks south, the light coming in from the right shows that it's afternoon, with dark clouds rolling in from the west. They pretend not so much the beginning of something, but to its end. But let's investigate that notion by looking quickly at two more paintings by Thomas Cole. They comprise a narrative series, a popular motif of the 19th century. The first one, called The Departure, shows a great warrior confidently setting out from his castle, accompanied by his knights and attendants on horseback. It is spring, in the morning, and spirits are high. This is the second painting, The Return. Here it is autumn, the sun is setting, and attendants carry the ailing warrior to a church, while his steed follows behind with its head down. The campaign did not go well, and what was beginning in the previous painting is ending in this one. I see parallels in Crapsy's Storaka Viaduct. Multiple art critics have compared its depiction of the railroad to classical European paintings that portray remnants of the Roman Empire. To me, Crapsy alludes to a preemptive nostalgia, with the prescient implication that while the age of steam was then rising, someday it would also fall. Nostalgia, though, can be a funny thing, and I like to keep in mind that whatever we might wistfully long for today had once been new and modern. Well, this is another painting from Peter Moss's collection. It's called The Last of the Manchester Defiance. It's an 1864 copy by W.R.B. Shaw of an 1859 painting by another artist. Note the two trains in the background at left. Peter provided a wonderful excerpt from the Illustrated London News of April 23, 1859, when the original painting first appeared, and I'd like to share it with you. The author called this work a striking illustration of the march of enterprise and civilization which distinguishes the present age. The old Manchester Defiance, which was once the marvel of the traveling world, has been put off the road by the superior powers of steam. And there the old wreck lies, horseless and wheelless, with the door off its hinges, a place for fowls to rest in a dilapidated inn-yard. The inns themselves, where extortion and incivility was the rule, have long been shut up and deserted. The glass of ale or brandy and water, with which the desperate outsider tried to console himself and infuse warmth in his drenched and chilled frame during the brief interval occasioned by the change of horses, is now dispensed with, and a man may arrive sober and comfortable and collected at the end of a 200-mile journey without having moved from his snug seat inside his first-class carriage. But again, nostalgia is a funny thing. And 10 years later, Mark Twain would have nothing of the commentary found in the Illustrated London News. Traveling by train through Europe in 1869, Twain had this to say in The Innocents Abroad. It is hard to make railroading pleasant in any country. It is too tedious. Stagecoaching is infinitely more delightful. Once I crossed the plains and deserts and mountains of the West in a stagecoach from the Missouri line to California. And since then, all of my pleasure trips must be measured to that rare holiday frolic. But again, nostalgia is fickle and minds can change. Just 2 years later, in 1871, Twain went west on our new transcontinental railroad, an event he chronicled in Roughing It, published in 1872, where he wrote, "We rolled out of the station at Omaha and started westward on our long jaunt. A couple of hours out, dinner was announced, an event to those of us who had yet to experience what it is to eat in one of Pullman's hotels on wheels. So, stepping into the car next forward of our sleeping palace, we found ourselves in the dining car. It was a revelation to us, that first dinner on Sunday. And though we continued to dine for 4 days and had as many breakfasts and suppers, our whole party never ceased to admire the perfection of the arrangements and the marvelous results achieved. Incidentally, this print is perhaps the best of the many that featured our first transcontinental railroad. Fannie Palmer, an English immigrant, was one of our best and most prolific printmakers. Currier and Ives published many of her works, including this one, whose full title is Across the Continent, Westward the Course of Empire, It Takes Its Way. One hallmark of these views of the Transcontinental Railroad is how the tracks invariably run arrow straight across the land, a symbol of destiny and permanence. It's also interesting to note that Palmer took artistic license to depict our first transcontinental railroad as a double-track main line. I can assure you it was a single track in the 19th century. Palmer's work is layered with additional symbolic meaning. The tracks quite literally divide the industry of new civilization on the left with the untamed natural world on the right, where 2 American Indians on horseback watch helplessly as the smoke of the iron horse engulfs them. Railroads helped usher in the industrial age, and regardless of whether the people impacted wanted these changes or not, artists portrayed this both subtly and overtly. Even more symbolic than Palmer's print is American Progress by John Gast from 1872. Here we have an allegorical female figure symbolizing the American nation, stringing telegraph wires and carrying the Book of Education as she floats westward with settlers, who travel first on foot, then by covered wagon and stagecoach, and finally by train. They drive off American Indians, bison, and other wildlife. Even the weather patterns seem to be reversed, as the light dawning in the east appears to be pushing off the clouds lingering over the mountains to the west. Now, if these last 2 images appear a bit heavy-handed in their symbolism, remember that the Civil War had ended just a few years earlier. The nation was reunited, but the union was tenuous and hostilities festered, particularly in the South. These images spoke to renewal in a new union with a new economy, defined not by North and South, waterborne transport, and animal power, but defined instead by East and West, iron roads, and the power of steam. I should note that we were not alone in our use of allegorical female figures to illustrate our railways. This poster from 1900 portrays Switzerland's Gothard Railway as the unifier of Northern and Southern Europe. The figure here stands on the winged wheel of the railways, while her hands clutch the many lines of France, Belgium, and Germany. Zurich is right on the top of her heart, while the many spiral tunnels and loops of the Gothard line seem to form her intestines. Below them is the Lake District and the great Italian industrial and financial city of Milan. Now, while we're in Europe, let's consider the work of French master Claude Monet, founder of Impressionism and widely acknowledged as one of the greatest painters of all time. Monet made several railway paintings in the 1870s, including a series inside a Paris train station in 1877. I have to share a brief aside from a brochure published by the Art Institute of Chicago about Monet's work. They wrote that to convince the station master of the busiest train station in Paris to give him permission to paint in the station and train yard, Monet put on his best suit, fluffed out his ruffled cuffs, and carried a gold-tipped cane. Monet gave his card to the station master and announced that he wished to paint there. Not only did Monet get permission to paint, but the engineers ran the trains in and out of the stations as many times as Monet wanted. It was this series of paintings that fully elevated the railroad to a subject worthy of the fine arts. Now think about that for a moment. We've read several excerpts by great writers who discuss the railroad, and while trains show up frequently in literature, the great railroad novel that you might expect to find in 19th century American or British literature simply does not exist. And it's much the same for these paintings we've been looking at. There are many that include the railroad, but usually as a small element, off in the distance. Yet when you stop to consider the greater context of 19th century art, with its dictums of what was proper subject matter and what was not, the very fact that the railroad shows up as much as it does is nothing short of remarkable, and a testament to the railroad's great power and appeal. Monet was the tipping point. He was the first significant painter, according to Ian Kennedy again, to record the locomotive with any degree of physical presence, and his station scenes from Paris brought the railroad completely into the realm of fine art. The overall impact was even greater. In part because of the railroad, everyday objects and common people finally started to become acceptable subjects for artists of all kinds. And while we didn't get the great railway novel of the 19th century, Walt Whitman did give us a great railway poem, To a Locomotive in Winter, which he wrote in 1876, the same time that Monet was making his railway paintings. And I think it's only fitting to show a few more Monets while reading Whitman's poem. Thee for my recitative, thee in the driving storm, even as now, the storm, the winter day declining, thee in thy panoply, thy measured dual throbbing and thy beat convulsive, thy black cylindric body, golden brass and silvery steel, thy ponderous sidebars, parallel and connecting rods, gyrating, shuttling at thy sides, thy metrical, now swelling pant and roar, now tapering in the distance, thy great protruding headlight fixed in front, thy long, pale, floating vapor pennants, tinged with delicate purple, the dense and murky clouds outbelching from thy smokestack, thy knitted frame, thy springs and valves, the tremulous twinkle of thy wheels, thy train of cars behind, obedient, merrily following, through gale or calm, now swift, now slack, yet steadily careering, type of the modern, emblem of motion and power, pulse of the continent, for once come serve the muse, and merge in verse, even as here I see thee, with storm and buffeting gusts of wind and falling snow, by day thy warning ringing bell to sound its notes, by night thy silent signal lamps to swing. Fierce-throated beauty, roll through my chant with all thy lawless music, thy swinging lamps at night, thy piercing madly whistled laughter, thy echoes rumbling like an earthquake, rousing all. Law of thyself complete, thine own track firmly holding, no sweetness debonair of tearful harp or glib piano thine. Thy trills of shrieks by rocks and hills returned, launched o'er the prairies wide, across the lakes, to the free skies, unpent and glad and strong. From that point forward, the railroad appeared more frequently and in more dominant roles in art of every form. We're going to look at just a few examples before returning to paintings. We'll start with the then brand new medium of the motion picture. We'll stay in France for one more slide, a frame from one of the very first commercial films in the world. It features the railroad, of course. This is Arrival of a Train, made in 1895 by the Lumiere brothers. The 19th century may not have given us the great railroad novel, but the 20th century gave us plenty of great railroad movies. And there's something fitting about that. It took a new form of art, the motion picture, to fully embrace the transformational technology of the railroad. This is Buster Keaton in his 1926 silent film, The General. Initially a flop at the box office, today it is widely considered a classic of the silent era. It also helped establish the cinematic pairing of trains and Western landscapes. While the plot is based on the great locomotive chase of the Civil War, which took place in Georgia, directors Keaton and Clyde Bruckman filmed their chase scenes in Oregon, where high bridges and steep mountain grades provided a more dramatic setting. And we'd be here all night if we dug very far into railroads in the movies. And while that would be a lot of fun, I'm not prepared to go any further right now. Except to say that 1964's The Train, starring Burt Lancaster and directed by John Frankenheimer, ranks among the top 5 in every list of great railroad movies I've ever seen. It's an extraordinary film, so if you're looking for one train movie to watch, I highly recommend this one. Now, we'd also be here all night if we started digging into railroads and music. Like movies, the vast number of train songs offers further evidence of just how pervasive the railroad had become in 20th century life. You won't find many railroad references in classical music, but in so many of the musical genres that developed from the late 19th century right up to today, the railroad is everywhere. And even in musical theater, which we covered in the Center's Journal in 2014, the author, Aviva Gelman, is a UW graduate who interned with us for several years. It had never occurred to me that you could fill even a page about railroads and musical theater, but Aviva had a great interest in the subject, and she found more than enough material for a feature article. She begins with the opening number from The Music Man, where traveling salesman Howard Hill sings aboard a passenger train on the Rock Island Railroad, to music that mimics the clickety-clack of steel wheels on jointed rail, This photograph, incidentally, is from a 2011 production by the Skylight Music Theater in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. But let's get back to paintings, now that railroads have come fully into their own. With the rise of modernism in the early 20th century, the conflict of technology and nature faded in artistic dialogue. The city replaced the wilderness as the central theme occupying the national imagination. Modernist painters use railroad imagery to portray the progressive vitality of the modern world, with images of trains evoking the notions of speed and power. George Lutz painted roundhouses at High Bridge in 1910, in which, to quote Ian Kennedy again, he depicted an everyday occurrence in a nondescript location and found in it unexpected grandeur. As foreshadowed by George Inness more than a half-century earlier, industrial capitalism is shown here as the national religion, and the smoking roundhouse has replaced St. Peter's as the basilica of the New World. When the Depression-era Public Works of Art project asked artists to depict the American scene, many of them tackled industrial subjects, including railroads. Austin Mecklem left his home in rural Woodstock, New York, and traveled to the industrial Hudson River port of Kingston, where he painted his dramatic Engine Houses and Bunkers, a large format oil painting featuring a locomotive shop as its centerpiece. The work vividly portrays man-made objects, while humans appear very small and nature is pushed to the boundaries. Meanwhile, back in England, we find similar trends. By now, there was no question that the railway was worth the attention of the nation's best artists. This painting, completed by Stanhope Forbes in 1925, was a study for a larger work. Peter Moss acquired this one. The final version, which is a much wider landscape format, resides at the National Railway Museum in York, England. As with Mecklem, the built environment occupies nearly all of the composition. Here, though, the people are far more prominent, and we see all walks of life mingling on the station platform, evidence of the democratizing force of railway travel. Democratizing, but often still segregated, as we see in this artist's take on the platform scene. This is Train Station, a 1935 painting by Black artist Walter Ellison. It's small, at just 8 by 14 inches, executed in oil on cardboard, and it resides today at the Art Institute of Chicago. The artist composed his work in a W, after his first name. Ellison was born in Georgia in 1899, and this painting is set in Macon. On the left, affluent white passengers board a southbound train for vacations in Miami and other beach resorts. On the right, Black passengers head for northbound trains, with destinations of New York, Detroit, and Chicago. This is part of what we now call the Great Migration. Many railroads offer deeply discounted tickets for group travel that help make this possible. And I think the railroads' reasons were probably more opportunistic than altruistic, but trains undeniably played a significant role in the many mass migrations of Blacks from the South to the North, Midwest, and West. Railroads became popular subjects for Black artists, who have considered everything from their exploitative and often discriminatory labor practices to their symbolism as pathways to new lives and greater freedom. Now, for all their power to transform society, railroads also introduce new risks. Some artists question these directly in their work. Thomas Hart Benton, a regionalist painter who came from the modernist school, celebrated rural American life in much of his work. Trains were frequent subjects, and at least 2 of his paintings present concerns over safety. This one, The Engineer's Dream from 1931, shows a nightmare or a premonition. At lower right, we see an engineer asleep in his bed, fully dressed for duty with his railroad lantern and his alarm clock beside him. He dreams of a wreck where his speeding train cannot stop in time to avoid a washed-out bridge. We see him attempting to jump to safety, but his chances for survival do not look good. At right, the signalman's red flag is wholly inadequate against the powerful locomotive, perhaps a commentary on safety systems of the day, or even a broader statement about humanity in the face of onrushing technology. Ultimately, though, the modernists embraced technology, and for the steam locomotive, the most significant modernist painting is this one, Charles Schieler's 1939 Rolling Power. It is a close-up precisionist study of the wheels, rods, and valve gear of a New York Central Hudson locomotive that pulled the 20th Century Limited, the railroad's flagship train between New York and Chicago. While the locomotive features streamlining by noted industrial designer Henry Dreyfuss, Schieler chose to focus on the least streamlined, most raw mechanical elements. More recent photographs have popularized views like this one in railroad imagery, but rolling power was nothing short of groundbreaking in its day. It has been hailed as a radical departure from previous artistic representations of trains, for the way it redefines beauty in the image of a functional object. We've been watching artists for more than 100 years grapple with what the steam railroad meant. So it's almost ironic to me then that in 1939, on the eve of its replacement by diesels, the steam locomotive finally transcended the societal questions surrounding it, freed from context, as a thing of beauty unto itself. The steam locomotive was the single most compelling icon of the railroad. After diesels replaced steam, artistic representations of the railroad changed greatly. And after our next artist, the critical commentary also begins to run dry. The academic community has yet to take on a major consideration of railroads and art in the past 70 years, but I think there's still plenty to see. One of the most famous American artists to approach railroads was Edward Hopper. He painted them, Ian Kennedy pointed out, because they were part and parcel with his experience of American life. He also painted them with enough frequency that they must have held some special meaning. Yet despite growing up in the age of steam, Hopper focused on railroad subjects other than locomotives. One consistent theme throughout almost all of Hopper's work is the loneliness and alienation he felt was an ever greater part of modern American life. I'm sure we can all relate to that in our own recent lives. And you certainly see it here, with the railroad signal tower standing alone and empty against a twilight sky. And I see some echoes of Hopper's work in some of Charlie's paintings, and I'll come back to that at the end. Alienation is a central theme of what some critics and scholars consider the greatest American novel of the 20th century, The Great Gatsby. It directly confronts what author F. Scott Fitzgerald considered to be the excesses of an over-materialistic culture of the 1920s. Prophetically, perhaps, the automobile is the dominant and highly symbolic mode of transportation in the book. But there is a poignant passage about railroads at the end, in a flashback scene for Nick Carraway, the novel's narrator. He recalls, when we pulled out into the winter night and the real snow, our snow, began to stretch out beside us and twinkle against the windows, and the dim lights of small Wisconsin stations moved by, a sharp, wild brace came suddenly into the air. We drew in deep breaths of it as we walked back from dinner through the cold vestibules, unutterably aware of our identity with this country for one strange hour, before melting indistinguishably into it again. That's my Middle West. Not the wheat or the prairies or the lost Swede towns, but the thrilling returning trains of my youth. I said we'd be getting back to nostalgia, and here we are. The nostalgia is a dominant theme of most railroad paintings of the last 60 years, which have seen the rise of a distinct genre of railroad art. Its hallmark is a literal style of scenes that no longer exist, with the steam locomotive as the central figure. This one, by the talented and prolific Gil Bennett from 2008, shows the Milwaukee Road's Hiawatha passenger train steaming up the Minnesota side of the Mississippi River on its run from Chicago to the Twin Cities. Nick Carraway would have been on this route in The Great Gatsby. Gil presented at our annual conference in 2019. He lives in Utah and works almost entirely on commissions, taking his clients' fondest railroad memories, often from their childhoods, and rendering them on canvas or paper in oils or watercolors. Michael Flanagan, painting from his own memories, was perhaps the apex of this style. His work reimagines a steam-era Baltimore and Ohio railroad that he barely knew, yet one he clearly longed for. Flanagan wrote and illustrated a novel called Stations, published by Pantheon in 1994, with backing by none other than Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. Stations is a beautiful and evocative portrayal of Flanagan's longing for the steam railroads he saw as a child. This fictional narrative and photorealistic paintings of old imaginary photographs comprise a multi-layered exploration of human passion and obsession. You can find used copies today for a song, and you don't have to be a train lover to appreciate this beautiful book. Now, I said earlier that nostalgia is a funny thing, and it might be hard to imagine having nostalgia for relatively modern diesel locomotives, but we have arrived at that point, especially for the generation who grew up with these muscle machines of the 1960s and 70s. Mike Daniman, who lives just outside of Denver, is part of that generation, who longs not only for these now retired tunnel motor diesels, but also for the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad itself, one of many railroad identities merged out of existence and now part of the sprawling Union Pacific system. It's hard to pick a favorite among the many great recent artists for me of railroad paintings, but I think that Ted Rose, who grew up in Milwaukee, would have to be part of that discussion. Ted settled in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and he found success in its competitive art community with his watercolors, imbued with emotion through his mastery of color and form. Ted painted contemporary and historic scenes, and I don't think it's fair to say nostalgia was the driving force behind his work. I think as much as anything, he was motivated by a great fascination with the railroad environment of all eras. But nostalgia certainly played a role in some of his paintings, like this beautiful scene of Milwaukee's railroad shops and yards as they appeared during his childhood. That's the 35th Street Viaduct at the top, and today almost nothing below it remains. And nostalgia is strong in England too, as we can see here thanks to Peter Moss's collection. Terence Cuneo is considered the greatest of England's many fine railway artists, and this painting from 1990 touches on nostalgia not only for the steam locomotive, but also the manually operated signal boxes. And yes, that is a mouse sitting on the operator's chair at lower right. The mouse became Cuneo's trademark, and one appears in nearly all of his works as a playful mark of authenticity. Today, the standard bearer of British railway artists is John Austin, who attended our conference in 2014 as a guest of Peter's and returned as a presenter in 2018. This painting shows a Great Western locomotive, the King John, pulling a passenger train at Dawlish on the south coast around 1960. And while nostalgia is a great motivator of current railway artists on both sides of the Atlantic, it's far from the only motivation behind recent railroad art. The late Tom Faywell created advertising art for General Motors for more than 20 years. It's tempting to dismiss commercial art in the context of what we've been talking about today, but Faywell's style is so incredibly bold and strong that I think he warrants our consideration. These GP38-2 locomotives are about as utilitarian as locomotives come, yet with Faywell, they are bigger than life, faster, and twice as powerful. Tom presented at our conference in 2012 when he told us about landing his assignment with GM. He said an account rep named John Callahan from the Marsteller agency had noticed his work and thought he might be a good fit for one of their clients, the electromotive division of General Motors. John gave Tom the specs for the ad, blueprints of the locomotive, some rough copy, and said, "Do whatever you want, music to any artist's ears." Now, the initial presentation to EMD did not go well. In fact, the managers laughed at Tom's work. They said it has no wheels, the sky is too rough, the train looks like it's going to fall over. They threw him in the trash. But Callahan, the ad rep, wasn't deterred. He made sure some of Tom's drawings made it upstairs to EMD's corporate office, where he prevailed on the executives to give it a try. After the first ad hit, visibility skyrocketed, and the rest is history. Now, another example of commercial art that I'd like to briefly mention is J. Craig Thorpe. He's an illustrator in Seattle who frequently paints concept art, where he gives visual form to transportation projects, often as a means of helping them get off the ground. His paintings are frequently used in town hall meetings to convince skeptical residents of what a proposed project will look like. And he loved that he's still doing these actually in tangible paints rather than digital renderings. Craig calls this painting the possible, and it is a powerful example of how today's railroad art looks not only back at the past, but also ahead, towards the future. In 2013, the Center conducted a survey of current railroad artists in North America, which we published in our journal. Peter Moss put us in touch with Roger Watt, a British artist who lives in Vancouver, British Columbia, where he makes exquisitely detailed graphite drawings. They might still rely on nostalgia, but it's a different take. Watt does not try to recreate the past, and he embraces the weeds that are slowly reclaiming the steam locomotive. He has also made some very contemporary rail-themed drawings, including Times Square from 2013 a study of a New York City subway station and a train in motion. Motion is a frequent theme in Adam Normanden's work, another contemporary artist and another connection via Peter Moss. Adam lives in Los Angeles and paints modern railroad subjects in acrylics with photorealistic precision. When we interviewed Adam, he had this to say about his fascination with freight cars. To me, they are objects that are made to be functional. They are not made to be beautiful. They are made to serve a purpose. It's only through use and time that they become beautiful and interesting, as they develop a patina. As graffiti and grime and rust and all of these components build up, it creates a very unique persona to each particular freight car. And that, he says, is something I identified with. It's something that I hope life is, that as we gather more experience in life, the more interesting it becomes, the more interesting we become. I really like that parallel. That notion of the weathering process of time on industrial subjects also appears in Charlie Hunter's work. That 2013 art survey we conducted was my introduction to Charlie. He's since written an article for us about the boxcars exhibition he curated here at the Brattleboro Museum and Art. And more recently, he presented at our 2019 conference about his plein air painting tour through the Southwest by Amtrak. By the time he'd finished, I think everyone in the audience was ready to head to Union Station and board the next train to Santa Fe with him. Charlie calls his style contemporary realism, and I know that in the wider world of art, it's on the more literal, representational end of the spectrum. Within the railroad community, though, it's still pretty expressionistic, and that's something I really like about it. We've had quite a few talented railroad artists doing literal and representational work. The selections I've shown you tonight are just the tip of the iceberg. So it's exciting for me to see someone like Charlie approaching railroad subjects a little differently and doing it so well. And there are others too, and Charlie has introduced us to some of them. His boxcars exhibition included this 6-foot wide piece by Tim Saturnow, featuring a bridge on New York City's High Line, which is an elevated freight railroad that's been turned into a wildly popular urban trail. Another artist doing more impressionistic railroad work is Catherine Gibbs. I have to admit that I had never heard of her until this painting, Miles to Go Before I Sleep, won Best in Show at an art exhibition in 2016. We've since published an article about her railroad work, and there's a lot I like about it. I'm especially drawn to the bold brushstrokes and vibrant colors, and I like that she's tackling today's freight railroad, looking neither backwards nor forwards, but as it exists right now. The railroad, for all its utilitarianism, is still an endlessly fascinating subject. And Charlie understands that too. His paintings in this exhibition explore a fascination with railroad hardware, and particularly signals, both the ones that warn motorists and pedestrians of approaching trains at railroad crossings, and the ones like this that govern the movements of the trains themselves. Many artists share this fascination, and we've already seen several examples tonight, from railroad artists like Michael Flanagan and Terence Cuneo, to pillars of the art world like Claude Monet and Edward Hopper. In this painting of Charlie's, I can especially hear the echoes of Hopper's Railroad Sunset. There's the formality of their compositions, the dignity they both afford to these structures, and a certain sense of isolation. There's beauty here, but it's solemn, contemplative. Railroad signals exist for safety, as well as efficiency. While the earliest signals required human operators, most of them from the past several decades have been automated. They have enabled railroad companies to eliminate jobs like crossing guards and operators stationed in signal towers. Yet these signals, particularly the older ones, have a certain sense of character. We sometimes call them sentinels for their unwavering guard duty through the days, the seasons, the years. In today's depopulated railroad landscape, signals provide some of the only visual clues about whether a train is coming, the only way for an outsider to glimpse into the inner workings of the railroad. Now many of these old soldiers are being retired and replaced by new models. As wireless communications continue to improve, railroads may not even need line-side signals at some point in the future. For the ones that still stand, they remind us, as Charlie says, stop, look, and listen. And for a few people, like Charlie Hunter, they beg for something more: a photograph, a sketch, or a trip home for brushes and pigment, and a plein air painting session, and another piece in the nearly 2-century tradition of railroads and art. That concludes my presentation tonight. Thank you so much for tuning in. And thanks again to the Brattleboro Museum and Art Center for inviting and hosting me. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Scott, I'm speechless. That was just phenomenal.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Danny.
Thank you so much. You know, we have ideas sometimes about what will make a useful event in connection with an exhibition that we have up, a useful presentation, and then we think that we've lined it up, and you know, I would say like about 50% of the time it kind of isn't exactly what we had in mind. This was exactly what we hoped for and more. What a phenomenal presentation.
Thank you.
And bringing us right up to Charlie Hunter's work. I can't thank you enough. And maybe my reaction is colored a bit because I love trains so much and railroad art. And so exciting for me to see some of the work that you shared that I was unfamiliar with. Who is the name of the artist, the British artist who's in Vancouver? Roger Watt?
Roger Watt, yes. His charcoal drawings are just phenomenal.
Wow, amazing.
And he actually presented at one of our online conferences. You can find his presentation on our YouTube channel, and I strongly encourage you to check it out.
I will absolutely do that. And the other artist whose work I was not familiar with and just loved is Ted Rose.
Oh my gosh, Ted Rose is a pillar of the railroad art community, and of course a local hero to us in Wisconsin, being from Milwaukee originally. Ted's watercolors he captures something about the essence and the poetry and the emotions of railroading that I think he does as well as any artist who's ever approached the subject. Ted grew up in Milwaukee in the 50s and 60s when you could tune in on the AM radio to those great Southern music stations blasting the blues up from the South. And I think those blues musicians really spoke to Ted and informed his sensibilities as an artist. And I did have we have a traveling exhibition of Ted's mainly photography. He was a photographer only for a few years as a young man in his late teens and early 20s. His black and white work is phenomenal, and it showed a lot of his kind of young sensibilities that would come out later in his paintings. I think we have 4 watercolors and 1 charcoal drawing in that show too. And it's so much fun to get that one out and see those works up on the walls. And that was out at the Colorado Railroad Museum most recently. It was actually there last year during the pandemic, and I got to do a presentation to them about Ted's work there, and that was really meaningful to me to get to think more about Ted and his work.
Is Ted still living?
No, he sadly died pretty young. He was, I think, only in his early 60s, and when cancer claimed him, I believe that was in 2004. And I went out to visit his widow, Polly, in Santa Fe a couple of times, and she still has a number of his works. And as she was showing them to me, I was just astounded by how many of them he had completed in 2004. I mean, he was literally painting right up to the end. Like, it wasn't like he was out of time. It was like he was this musician up on the stage for an encore, just playing his heart out until the final note's drawn. I mean, it was really that was very emotional for me to see how much of that work he did so late in his life when he knew he was dying, but just had to keep painting.
Well, I can't wait to discover more of that work.
He did a book that was Ted, just a quick note on that. Ted did a book with Indiana University Press about his paintings called In the Traces, which came out in just a couple years before he died, maybe in 2002. And it's certainly one I highly recommend if you have any. I know you can find used copies of it pretty easily. In the Traces is the name of it.
In the Traces. Fantastic. I will go out and do that right away. I have there's a comment here from Arvid. saying Ted Rose painted with watercolors and he could capture the steam, oil, and coal smell.
Amen.
Yeah, that evident from just that one piece that Scott shared. Charlie Hunter's been providing a running commentary in the comments on Facebook live stream.
Excellent. Hi, Charlie.
But he also asked, was the piece by Watt a conscious reference to Schieler's rolling power?
That is something we would have to ask Roger, and it's something I'm afraid I did not think to ask him. I'm sort of embarrassed now that I didn't, and I'd be very interested to know that. I'll see if I can find that out, Charlie.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Roy asks, any comments about the railroad artist Griff Teller?
Absolutely. Now, Griff did some phenomenal work for the Pennsylvania Railroad. And in fact, one of our board members, Kevin Keefe, has recently blogged about some of Griff Teller's work. If you want to check out Kevin's blog on the Trains or Classic Trains magazine website. Griff Teller was really did some, again, like some of these other artists, he was commissioned by the railroads, but I think in several cases his work rose above the merely commercial realm to something more. He was certainly someone who understood the essence of railroading and was able to capture it in his work.
Thank you. I encourage all of you out there, if you have other questions or comments, please type them in at any time and we'll get them to Scott. Scott, a question that came up for me.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not sure if I was interpreting everything correctly, and of course, you're only giving us a slice, of the bigger picture of railroad art. But I began to have the sense that a lot of current railroad art seems to be like there was a lot of what you showed us where it's living artists today depicting historical scenes.
Yes.
And it made me think that's really a really different thing than what Charlie does. I mean, Charlie is really, warts and all, this is what railroad infrastructure looks like today. And I love Charlie's work, and I think it's so powerful. Is Charlie an outlier in that respect?
I would say that, in the overall mainstream trend of railroad artists, there are probably more people painting with sort of that nostalgia-driven sense of the past. But there are certainly some that are like Charlie that are looking, holistically and critically and holding up that mirror to the contemporary railroad landscape. It's exciting for me to find them because they are probably, I don't know that I'd call them outliers, but I'd say they're probably in a significant minority compared to what we see in some other railroad work. And so it's, I'm someone who, while I love all of our historic photographs in our archives at the center, when I go out to photograph trains, I usually don't go to the museums to photograph the historic steam locomotives, even though I love them. I go out to photograph the contemporary operations and railroads as they exist today because they're still interesting to me, even though the technology has changed. It's an industry that relies far more on technology and on capital and far less on humans and a labor-driven environment. And so there's been just all of those changes that people who love trains and railroads have had to grapple with. We're at a point now, and especially since 9/11, which is now 20 years ago, but that's really been, the majority of my adult life, where it's been very difficult to approach the railroad at close range. There's been security concerns, there's been liability concerns. The railroads generally haul freight and they operate out of the public eye, and they're pretty happy that way, and don't really, with some exceptions. Union Pacific certainly has done some nice events with their historic steam locomotives. Norfolk Southern and some others have done events that do some public outreach, but by and large the railroads they operate out of sight, out of mind for the majority of the time, and so it can be challenging to be able to get up close to them other than at grade crossings. But I still think they're beautiful, they're interesting, they're significant, they're powerful. That power is wielded to great effect, both for good and ill. And I find all of it fascinating. And I'm glad to see artists like Charlie who are looking at the railroad as it exists now and interpreting it in contemporary art. And I'm glad for the artists who look backwards and give us some views of the past that we might not be able to see, but we can see it through their eyes and through their paint. So I mean, I think there's a place for all of it, and it's exciting to have different things to be able to talk about.
Wonderful, wonderful. What a fun job you have.
Oh, it is a delight, absolutely.
Charlie's asking about Leslie Reagan.
It's another great artist of the past. One I am not quite as familiar with, so I mean, I'm certainly familiar with Reagan's work. I believe it's some really significant works for the New York Central, if I recall correctly. But outside of that, I don't want to say something without being better informed. So I'll have to pass on critical commentary there for the moment.
Mm-hmm. Any thoughts about Thomas Wolfe and his writings about trains?
Yes, no, so for a brief period of my life, after engineering school, I worked at an engineering magazine for a couple of years where I discovered that I really enjoyed the writing and the magazine design work more than the engineering subject matter. And that was sort of the first step that led me to my life at the Center for Railroad Photography and Art. But in the process of doing that, in realizing I liked writing so much, I started going back to our local community college to take literature classes because I wanted to know more about this. And so I was exposed to some of the great, American and British authors and some others. And, in the course of this came across Thomas Wolfe and You Can't Go Home Again, which has I think some of the most beautiful passages of railroads and literature that have ever been written, particularly his description of watching the long distance passenger train between, his home and I think in Asheville, North Carolina, going north or coming, south from New York City. And that feeling of longing to be on board, the clash of class and cultures between the well-heeled travelers and the Pullman cars and the sharecroppers watching it go by from their fields. I mean, it just encapsulated so much of the contrasts and the dichotomies that railroads introduced to the world at large, and brought that sort of modern world of the cities of the East, into the most rural communities all over the country. And Wolfe just captured that beautifully in his writing, and it's kind of made me want to get out that You Can't Go Home Again and reread those passages. They're really beautiful.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Scott, do you know about photographer David Plowden's connections to our neck of the woods here, southeastern Vermont?
I do indeed. No, David is a dear friend, and we've been fortunate to have him present at several of our conferences in the past and contribute to some of our exhibitions and publications. And of course, he grew up in New York City and went to the Putney School in Vermont and did some wonderful work on the Rutland Railroad and elsewhere around there. And that's a wonderful connection that you have, and I envy you for it.
We had the great pleasure, it must have been, it was just before COVID, of showing a selection of David's photographs of bridges, actually. We selected only, from his beautiful book on bridges. And David informed me that the very first photograph he ever took was on the platform at the train station in the town where I am right now, just a few miles from where I am in Putney, Vermont. And it was the second attempt at the first photograph, because he was on the platform with his mother with his little brownie, is it called a brownie camera? Brownie
box camera, yes. Yes.
Box camera. And that big beast of a locomotive came in, and he was so scared that he couldn't take the picture, but they went back the next day. And that was the first picture that David took. What a gentleman, and what an incredible body of work he's produced over the years.
Yes, and I mean, he's and I think in some similar traditions to Charlie as a photographer, David has gone out and held up that mirror to the world and showed us it exactly as it exists. And David likes to say that he spent a lot of his life one step ahead of the wrecking ball, starting with the steam locomotives, photographing them right before they went away, going on to the
Right.
great steamships of the Atlantic and photographing them before they went away. Steel mills, rural America, so many of these things that were really foundational parts of the American landscape. And thank goodness people like David Plowden went out and preserved a visual record of them before it was lost.
Oh, yeah. And Charlie's asking about a photographer, Phil Hastings.
Yeah, so Phil Hastings was, I think he was right up there with the greatest. And there was a real crop of really talented photographers that came out around the middle of the 20th century. And, this was a time when amateur photography itself was on the rise. We had the booming economy after World War II. We had lots of people that were coming back and finding jobs and having more leisure time and having more disposable income. We had the rise of car culture, and while that was horrible for passenger trains, it was great for itinerant photographers wanting to travel all over the country and take pictures of things in rural America on our, developing highway systems. And so Phil Hastings was one of these. And, as a lot of photographers were grappling with the end of steam, and it was imminent. The first diesel locomotives were introduced in the 1930s. And by the, World War II was sort of a stay, as we needed so much of our oil for the war effort, that steam really continued to dominate. But then after the war, it was very clear that diesels were going to replace steam. And so this launched several of these photographers on really epic quests to go out and capture the steam locomotives at the end. And Phil Hastings famously did this with a man named David Morgan. Morgan was the editor of Trains magazine, which is kind of the big commercial publication that's dominated our field and really been a touchstone for since its inception in 1940. And so for several years, they would take these big road trips together in the summer, and Morgan would write essays, and Hastings would take photographs, and they would run them in the magazine, and they put them together in a book that has a quirky title. It refers to a New York Central locomotive called the Mohawk. And the title of the book is The Mohawk That Refused to Abdicate. And it's a great example of Morgan's very lyrical and poetic writing and how he really tended to personify these steam locomotives, which Phil did in his camera work as well. And there were several of these photographers who, made their peace, sometimes begrudgingly, with the end of steam and continued to find ways to make interesting photographs of the diesel railroad and, this landscape I've been talking about that has fewer people, it has, less infrastructure, and in some ways is less visually interesting than what came before it, but is still significant and still has, an interest and appeal of its own.
Fascinating. One more question, unless others chime in with further questions and you're willing to take them.
I'll certainly try.
I have a question, which is, can you think of other technological advances like the railroad technologies, or the development of a new technology that have been accompanied by a similar treatment in art as railroads? Maybe even maybe I'm just not thinking of it, and there's some technological development that has been even more, examined even more than railroads by artists and writers. But I'm just kind of flailing around for a little bit of comparison and reference and context for that.
No, it's a really good question, and it's something I've thought about a lot too. And I think I'm biased. I think there's a really wonderfully strong relationship between railroads and art that I like to think is at least a little bit unique. So so that's my bias speaking there. But certainly other forms of transportation have developed some sort of a following from artists and others that are trying to portray them, whether for historical record or artistic impression or interpretation. There is today a vibrant and active group of airplane photographers, and that's another group that has had severe challenges to their pursuits in the post 9/11 world, but who continue to find ways around them. One of the challenges there, one of the great sort of tropes of railroad photography is that epic shot of the train in the sweeping landscape, and I love those as much as anybody, and I aspire to them often in my work. But that's out, that's out in the middle of the run, away from the terminals. And you can't photograph an airplane like that. Your only chances to photograph airplanes really are at the airports, either at the gates or taking off or landing. And so, short of chartering your own plane and flying out in the clouds to try to get some basic shots of an airliner out there, which you'd probably get, that would probably be a pretty challenging thing to do these days. It's pretty difficult to photograph airliners outside of airports. And there's also, I'd say, a subculture of ship and maritime photographers, and David Plowden was certainly among those who did some really strong work around the ports of New York in particular, and some of the great ocean liners and the tugs, helping them in and out of the harbor there. And that trend continues. Again, it's kind of limited to the port facilities. Again, there are security concerns there sometimes with, strangers waving cameras around. But these are big places. There's often public property nearby, and so there is at least another subgenre of people that really enjoy photographing ships, and that's actually something I've enjoyed doing whenever I've been around ports and had that chance. I think in car culture, a car is something you can own, and so I think car culture often comes out in people who purchase and restore historic automobiles and take them to shows. But you can't own, well, with a few exceptions, it's much harder, I should say, to own a train or a plane or a large ship. And so, I think photography is a way that we can approach this. So many other technologies, electricity, fiber optic communications, the computers, semiconductors, all of these things have just led to profound changes, but they don't necessarily lend themselves very well to photographic documentation. In some cases, they certainly improve our abilities to make photographs, but making photographic or artistic interpretation of them, well, I'm sure some people are doing it, it just hasn't spawned the community that we've seen around something like railroading.
Yeah, interesting. We have a comment here from Wendy who says, I've thought that lighthouse fans are very similar to train admirers.
That is a great comparison, Wendy. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, and I know there are. I know of at least one person, a man named Pete Laro, who does photography charter trips, and he does some of these with restored steam locomotives, but he also does lighthouse tours to go out and photograph lighthouses, particularly on the Atlantic seaboard. And the photographs I see coming out of these are always really fantastic. So I know something like a lighthouse is just imbued with atmosphere, especially on a foggy morning or evening out on the coast someplace.
Scott, in the realm that you operate within and the center operates within, railroad photography and art, does the graffiti on freight trains live in that world somewhere? You shared an artist who talked a little bit about the graffiti and depicts maybe the graffiti on freight trains, but is it beyond that? Does the graffiti itself, the graffiti artist?
No, that's a great question too. It's certainly an area that never fails to elicit a strong response in our community on both sides. And I think we have some members who really view it purely as vandalism of private property, and I certainly understand that argument. We have some members who view it as art, and I think you can see that in examples of some of the great art museums of the world that have hosted exhibitions by graffiti artists. And it certainly taps into a part of culture that is often underrepresented and feels like they don't have a voice. And these canvases of freight cars are a way to take your message out into the world. Starting from, I think, the subways in New York in the 1960s, and now to the point today that it's often difficult to find a freight car without at least a little bit of graffiti on it. So it's certainly something that is prevalent. It's something that we come at from a lot of different angles. And even the big colorful kind of tagger murals and other forms of graffiti are some of the most obvious. But there are also much smaller things called monikers that sometimes hobos, sometimes railroad workers will have. And these are quick little doodles that you can do with a grease pencil or something like that. That will, I think the most famous or readily accessible is the Kilroy was here from World War II. But Within that genre, there are many contemporary moniker makers, and they often will accompany their drawing with some, a couple in a little poetic verse or something like that. And it's, for them, I think it's a way to talk to one another. And, they'll know that this guy down in the Southwest put his mark on this car that you now see rolling through the Northeast. And so it's a whole network unto itself. And I think it's one that has a lot of crossover with hobos, freight train riders, and even railroad workers themselves. And there are actually some, probably more connections between those communities than most people might realize. So no, it's another fascinating and prevalent part of the railroad visual culture.
Wow.
And I tell you, just another quick addition to that. One of the most interesting photographic studies I've seen of graffiti is a woman named Andrea Furman, who has done a series of, they're basically macro views of graffiti. And so she uses a telephoto lens and gets as close as she can to the point that you're not even looking at the whole tag or piece of graffiti art. You're zoomed in on really just the texture of the paint on the side of the car and its interplay with rust and how the different colors go together. And it's beautiful, it's transformative, it's a new way to look at this. And it's a great intersection between art and photography. And I think photography being used as a transformative function on the graffiti art and a new way of looking at it. And so I find her work just utterly beautiful and fascinating.
That's Andrea Furman?
Furman, I believe it's Furhraman.
Oh, okay. All right. Scott, this has been an extraordinary privilege. I have enjoyed this so much. I'm so grateful to you. So happy to know about the work you're doing and about the center. I plan to become a member right away.
Oh, we like to hear that.
I look forward to subscribing to the journal. This was just wonderful, and I can't thank you enough. And I also want to thank Charlie Hunter for providing us with the motivation to do this, a reason to do this, and connecting us to Scott. So thank you, Charlie. And by the way, I passed along some of Charlie's comments, but like 5% of them. So so you should just get in touch directly with Charlie because he has lots of other thoughts and ideas and suggestions and questions.
Will the comments be preserved on the Facebook feed?
Oh, I don't know how to do that or not do that, so I hope so.
Okay, well, we'll take a look there.
Okay, perfect. Before we sign off, I just want to let everyone out there know that a recording of this discussion tonight will be available on our website within the next day or two. That's brattleboromuseum.org. And so anyone you think might be interested, or you tuned in late, or you want to share it, that's where you'll find a link to this recording. While you're there on our website, you can check out recordings of dozens of other events that we've been presenting online over the past year and a half. You'll find those under events and then video archive. If you happen to be in the Brattleboro area, please come to the museum to see Charlie Hunter's artwork in person. You only got a glimpse of a couple of pieces here tonight. It's a fantastic exhibit. And I believe most of the work was already in private collections scattered around the country. And Charlie and curator Eric Aho, wonderful artist himself, went to great lengths to assemble these works, get them back temporarily from the collectors. And so it's a real privilege to see all that work together. A wonderful exhibit. We're open Wednesday through Sunday, 10 to 4. We're requiring masks again in the museum, but that's not a big deal, right? We all know how to do that, and there's certainly plenty of room for social distancing. If you can't come in person, or even if you can also take an interactive virtual tour of Charlie's exhibit and all the other exhibits that are currently on view at the Brattleboro Museum, also on our website, brattleboromuseum.org. And lastly, I want to say that if you enjoyed this event tonight and would like to make a donation to support this type of free programming that we offer, we would of course be very grateful for that. And that's yet something else you can do at brattleboromuseum.org. And I certainly would understand if you chose to donate your dollars to the Center for Railroad Photography and Art tonight instead, in honor of this wonderful presentation that Scott's given us.
Well, we will gratefully receive them, but certainly understand and encourage people to spread the generosity to whatever extent you're available to both institutions. You guys are doing phenomenal work there at the Brattleboro Museum and Art Center, and it's really a privilege for us to be able to tag on to it for at least this one evening, and hopefully again in the future.
Absolutely, yes, please. Let's talk about that. And
good.
The feeling is mutual. Thank you again, Scott. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, all of you out there. Stay safe, take good care of yourselves, and hope to see you sometime soon.
It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Good night, everyone.
Good night.